Good evening. Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting. It's October the 1st. I'll call the meeting to order. We do have a quorum tonight. Next item on our agenda is the consent agenda, and I'm required to read that. Thankfully, it's only one item and not 23. The mandatory referral for acquisition of approximately 2.2 acres along Veterans Parkway and Windrow Road for Murfreesboro Electric Department Substation, MED, and City of Murfreesboro applicant. Mr. Ives, are you doing this one?
It's on consent, so don't need to say a lot,
That's
I don't
right.
think, but I'm available for any questions if anyone has anything that they would like to ask about it.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion for approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
Have a motion and second. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed. Motion passes. The next item on our agenda is the annexation petition for approximately 114.17 acres along Blackman Road. Mr. Donald McDonald, applicant. Ms. Green, are you doing this one tonight?
Yes, sir. Thank you. You have before you a request to annex property for a total of 8 parcels located along Blackman Road. You can see these properties identified in purple color on the map before you. The area has been requested by the property owners to be annexed, and it's a total of 114.17 acres. The largest parcel is located along the western or eastern side of Blackman Road, and there are 7 undeveloped parcels that are located along the western side of Blackman Road. This annexation does include some public right-of-way. It includes approximately 0.44 acres of the Lyle McDonald Road, and if you're not familiar with Lyle McDonald Road, that is the road that runs south of those 7 parcels, and it's identified on the map. It also does include approximately 3.92 acres of Blackman Road right-of-way. This property is contiguous with the current city limits on the southern and eastern side. You can see the current city limits identified in yellow on the map before you. To the south is a developing single-family subdivision, and you'd be interested in the applicant has held a public or a neighborhood meeting on September 16th to meet with those neighbors along the south side at the Blackman Community Center. And, of course, it was welcome to those neighbors and anybody who was interested in the project. It was attended by the neighborhood, the HOA, and members of the planning staff. This property is identified in the Blackman Community Land Use Plan, and it has been contemplated that eventually this property would be annexed. There is a companion zoning change request that will be the subject of the next public hearing, but it's not the subject of this public hearing. This public hearing should be to consider the annexation of this property. Staff has studied the annexation of the property, and all city services can be provided to the area upon the annexation becoming effective. Most of the area is undeveloped and wouldn't require services immediately, but when it is developed, the developer will have the privilege to extend those services into the property. You should conduct a public hearing prior to making a recommendation to City Council regarding the annexation of these 8 parcels.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
In a minute, we'll open the public hearing for comment, but if you're not familiar with our public hearings, you'll be invited to come to the podium for or against. Please hold your comments to 3 minutes or less. Keep your comments addressed to this body, and at the end of the public hearing, we will try to answer all your questions that you provide. So with that, I'll open the public hearing. Anyone like to speak? Anyone at all? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Did I hit it too hard?
The applicant and representatives are in the audience if you have any questions from them regarding the annexation.
Council, is there, committee, is there any questions that you might have?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion, if there's no opposition, to approve.
We have a motion for approval
Second the motion.
and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Our second item, Ms. Green, are you?
It's me, sir.
You're going to read it, don't you?
Am I going to read? Okay. Is the zoning application 2014-422 for approximately 21.5 acres to be zoned commercial fringe, approximately 88.22 acres to be zoned commercial highway simultaneously with annexation. Mr. Donald McDonald, applicant.
Thank you, sir. This second public hearing, as I alluded to in the previous item, is a companion request for the annexation, which you just studied. The public hearing, the subject of the public hearing is to consider zoning those 8 parcels we just studied to CH and CF simultaneous with their annexation. Currently, the properties are zoned R15 in Rutherford County, and the area that's shaded orange on the map before you, which is approximately 88.22 acres, is being requested to be zoned CH. The property that's identified in the purple shade on the screen before you is approximately 21.59 acres, and the applicants requested to zone those to CF, and that's the Fringe Commercial District. The applicant has requested that a 250-foot strip along the south side and a 250-foot strip be located along the existing single-family developments and the developments that are underway to offer a little bit of a transition in commercial zones. The CH zone allows more uses than is permitted in the CF. The CF district also has some design standards that the CF does not, requiring that any gas pumps or solid waste be a certain distance from the homes. And so Mr. McDonald has requested that there be a 250-foot strip, the area shaded purple, zone CF, with the remaining property that is located along 840 or Blackman Road or Lyle McDonald Court to be zoned CH. The property, as I mentioned before, is also included in the Blackman Community Land Use Plan, which depicts this property to be used for mixed use and office distribution, and that would include retail, office, civic, institutional, and high-density residential uses that accommodate regional employment opportunities. It was expected that these areas would be developed with rather intense land uses that would have what we called a regional draw. The current implementation zones available to implement the scope of the uses contemplate the Blackman Land Use Plan. It could be either the CH, the CF zone, the LI, and the RM16, or a planned development zone. You can see that none of the property has been requested to be zoned planned development, LI, or RM16. And RM16 would allow multifamily uses. The CH and CF district allow no type of residential use as a primary use, and that, of course, is spelled out in our zoning ordinance. There was also that neighborhood meeting, at the same neighborhood meeting that discussed the annexation on September 16th at the Blackman Community Center, that also was discussion of the zoning change. And so you should conduct a public hearing regarding the zoning change request prior to making your recommendation. I'm going to invite a representative of the applicant, Mr. Clyde Roundtree, to the lectern to provide you some additional details on the request. He's also here with the applicant, Mr. McDonald, so if you have any questions from them, you can ask either before or after the public hearing, but you should conduct a public hearing prior to making your recommendation.
Any questions for Ms. Green before we start? Mr. Roundtree?
Thank you, Ms. Green. Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Clyde Roundtree. I'm with Huddleston Steel Engineering. And thank you for hearing our request. Mr. McDonald has lived on this property for over 30 years. It's located at 2101 Blackman Road. And he has every intention of staying on this piece of property. He's improved the property himself. He has a landing strip there, a hangar that he's recently built, and has every intention to keep it nice and to live there as long as he can, as long as he's able to fly, at least. Since owning the property, he's been impacted by Route 840 that actually went through his property, as well as Veteran Parkway. That also impacted his property. And so he's learned to respect the influence that regional planning and city planning can have on a piece of property. And in respecting that process, Mr. McDonald's been great to work with. And there's 3 significant things he's done that I feel like are really respectful to the planning process. First, as was mentioned by Mrs. Green, he's respected the Blackman Community Land Use Plan. And that does say that this land is slated in the future to be used for specific purposes, as Mrs. Green has mentioned, planned use areas, retail, office, civic, institutional, as well as there's another piece that has office distribution as possible use for the future of this piece of property. So in looking at the Blackman Land Use Plan, it's consistent with that offering. Secondly, Mr. McDonald's reached out to our planning staff. He's reached out to the city planning staff. He's reached out to the Berkshire Neighborhood Association. And as Margaret Ann's mentioned, we also had a community meeting as well. The results of that meeting were positive. We had a decent turnout, all things considered. And we feel like we answered the requests that the community had, the neighborhood had. So we followed the process, and that was also a recommendation that Planning Commission's put forward for us to accomplish as well. And thirdly, Mr. McDonald's been willing to listen to the city staff and planning staff to create a zoning request that maximizes the development potential, but also minimizes the impact on the adjacent neighborhood. And he's done that with as Mrs. Green's mentioned, creating that commercial fringe zone, that 250 feet along the adjacent property lines that could impact the adjacent neighborhoods. And within that commercial fringe zone, it's important to recognize that he's also created some restrictive covenants related to that. I'd like to name three that are really relevant. The minimum setback line, he's moved to 80 feet, so any building that's going to be built on the inside that commercial fringe will be 80 feet from the adjacent property lines. The height restriction is going to be 35 feet, so make sure there's nothing too tall along in that commercial fringe. And probably the most significant is he moved the landscape buffer to 30 feet versus 15 feet. That 30-foot landscape buffer will allow for the majority of the existing natural buffer that's in place to stay intact. We've driven on his mule, we went through the property and kind of looked at the various vantage points along from the neighborhood, and there's a really significant underbrush kind of growth along the buffer as well as some substantial trees. The majority of those trees would stay intact with Mr. McDonald's request to have a 30-foot landscape buffer versus the 15. So he has done a great process in terms of respecting the planning process that's over and above his property, being the Blackman Land Use Study, facilitating, utilizing our staff, utilizing city staff, working with the community, reaching out to the neighborhood to make sure that the neighborhood understands the implications. And lastly, just trying to do what he can, working with the city staff to say these are some of the implications we've learned from other zoning cases that said if we can put these restrictions in there, it helps it be more agreeable to the adjacent neighborhood. So I respect him and moving through that process. And lastly, I just want to thank the city staff just helping us move through the process as well and really helping us learn how best to respect the adjacent neighborhoods and making sure that they're respecting the process. I spoke with the head of the neighborhood association this afternoon just to make sure there's nothing that's come up in this last week related to the rezoning. And she said everything seems fine. She's had no feedback, and she is on board as far as the neighborhood community is concerned. And I'm open for any questions you may have. But thank you for hearing our requests, and thank you for your recommendations to come back and make sure those community meetings were accomplished prior to standing before you tonight. Thank you.
Any questions from Mr. Roundtree before we open the public hearing? I have one. The tree line along the subdivision and the tree lines in there, that's very dense. That will be part of his extended buffer and will not be torn down.
Chairman, to the best of our ability, it's the 30-foot. A lot of those trees are within that 30 feet. It's actually probably 80 feet of vegetation. It kind of undulates based on how the land's being farmed currently. But Mr. McDonald's desire is to keep as much of that intact with the future. So the 30-foot buffer helps protect and insulate that buffer, especially along the Berkshire neighborhood. So that would be respected.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right, with that, we'll open the public hearing. Invite anyone that would like to speak for or against this matter. I forgot to ask them to identify themselves.
Hello, my name is Sarah Zwerko. I live at 1526 John Lee Lane, which is the new Blackman Meadows subdivision, which is going in, I guess, to the east of this property. So not Berkshire, where they've spoken to the homeowner association. Ours is still a small neighborhood that doesn't have a established homeowners association yet. And there's two other neighborhoods there that I guess this impacts: Oakton and Princeton Oaks Meadows. I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly. And the first we heard about it was when we received a letter. Some of us received letters in the mail from the City Planning Commission, and honestly, I don't know a whole lot about zoning and planning restrictions. I mean, I read the letter and tried to ascertain all the information I could. I found what Mr. Crabtree here had to say very enlightening and helpful. I'm glad to know that they are doing everything they can to help the neighborhoods that are here. They're, very friendly neighborhoods. And when I received this, that was my first concern. Oh no, we're going to get a strip mall in our backyard, and this is a neighborhood or neighborhoods that have a lot of families, a lot of kids. Great if it was parks or schools or that sort of neighborhood friendly institution. But I read it. I read this stuff, and it said, CH zoning is like Old Fort Parkway, Northwest Broad Street, Memorial Boulevard, and I first thought strip malls. And I was like, that doesn't seem to fit in with the neighborhood feel that is back in that section of town. And so that, at least mine and some of my neighbors that I've spoken to, would be our biggest concern. And so I just came tonight to voice that and let that be known. We love the airstrip that's there. He is meticulous in maintaining it. It is a beautiful property, and I would hate to see it become just another strip mall section of town. So, thank you.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Anyone else like to speak? Anyone at all?
I'm Donald McDonald, the guy, the villain. I probably will not be doing anything with this property for many years as long as I'm able to fly. It's hard to reestablish an airstrip anywhere in Rutherford County now without a lot of restrictions. So it will remain pretty much like it is for as long as I'm capable to use it. Of course, we're all get older, and there may come a time when I won't be able to. But at present, I have no applicants, or I haven't had anyone to contact me about a commercial endeavor whatsoever. And as you folks are pretty smart, you know that this is a green area as far as commercial is concerned. It's going to be quite some time before we'll ever have any commercial in that area. But someday, maybe. And at that time, we would like to be able to develop it with the Blackman Land Use Plan. And that's what I'm doing now, is trying to get that lined up in advance. And I appreciate your cooperation and your help and your listening to us tonight.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Anyone else like to speak? Anyone at all? Any questions from anyone? Okay. Hearing none, I'll close the public hearing. What are the wishes of this commission?
Just a question or a comment, either Ms. Green or Ms. Alott, in reference to the young lady's question with respects to commercial highway and strip centers, and very definitely that would be available in the commercial highway zone. But as part of this applicant's application, he is trying to buffer that with commercial fringe. So could we get an idea of, and this may be a little more difficult, but what may not be allowed in commercial fringe that isn't allowed in commercial highway, so we give her a little peace of mind of what would be backing up to her house or her neighborhood?
Yes, sir. Commercial fringe and commercial highway have many similarities, but the biggest difference is that the commercial fringe excludes uses like hotels, it excludes motels, it excludes automotive repair, automobile sales. It excludes some uses like those heavier end is what it's intended. And the ones I mentioned are specific. I'm certain of those. One of the bigger differences is that there's also a restriction that gasoline sales or a drive-up window for a restaurant cannot be within 250 feet of a residential property unless it's approved by the BZA. And in those cases, it usually would require that the drive-up window be on the far side of the property. So that's the biggest difference. You could also check our zone ordinance for on our website to look at the differences, or call our office. We'll be glad to elaborate in greater detail.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
There are none. I'll make a motion that we approve the application, subject to any staff comments.
And I'll second that motion.
Have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, motion passes. Thank you. Our next item is a zoning application 2014-402 for approximately 3.6 acres to be rezoned from RS10 to commercial highway at Bradyville Pike and South Rutherford Boulevard. Mr. David Waldron, applicant.
Thank you. Our third public hearing this evening is for you to consider rezoning approximately 3.6 acres from its current RS10 zone, and RS10 is single-family residential district. RS10 allows single-family homes with a minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet by right and some other type uses. They want to rezone that from RS10 to CH, which is Highway Commercial District. We've had some discussion this evening about the types of uses that would be allowed in Commercial Highway District. And those, of course, if this were approved, would be permitted on this property. The property you can see on the map before you is shaded orange, and it's a somewhat odd-shaped lot. You can see that this parcel has frontage on 4 roads, has along South Rutherford Boulevard, also along Highway 99. You can see that it curves along Willow Drive, and a small portion of the property is along Floyd Avenue. So it is a somewhat odd-shaped lot, and you can see that here. The property has been in Murfreesboro for quite some time, has had some history involved, and seen some change as well. It was originally annexed in 1967, a portion of the property was, and then the remaining portion of the property was annexed in 1973. It was a part of a larger parcel that was developed as the Wilson Estate subdivision, and you can see the smaller lots around it are a part of the Wilson Estate subdivision. Because this property was bounded on its west side by Bradeville Pike and on its north side by the then planned for Rutherford Boulevard, the former owner retained this property and did not subdivide it with the remainder of the tract. Prior to 1984, the property was zoned R2, and of course in 1984 when we adopted our new zoning ordinance, it was zoned RS10 at that time. Rutherford Boulevard didn't exist as we know it now. It was contemplated and being planned for, but the exact route wasn't known, and so there was an estimated street alignment, but we of course didn't know the street alignment. Rutherford Boulevard has now been constructed a little different than what we originally planned, but of course you can see that now. There are some limitations on the property, and it has those multiple fronts, which means there's a higher setback for any future structures there. It has a very large drainage conveyance along the front of South Rutherford Boulevard and along Bradeville Pike. It also goes through the middle of the property. And it appears that with the size of the property and the current zoning, RS10, it is possible that there could be 10 single-family lots created from this parcel, although some of those lots would surely have unusual shapes due to the shape of the parcel. The owner contends that the circumstances have changed and has now requested that you consider changing the zone from the residential zone to commercial highway district. You, of course, should conduct a public hearing prior to making your recommendation regarding the zoning change request. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them either before or after the public hearing, and a representative of the applicant is here this evening as well.
Any questions before we get started with the public hearing? I have a question. Ms. Green, you had mentioned a drainage easement along the front, or a drainage, what was the word you used?
Conveyance.
Conveyance,
Yes,
yes.
sir.
Later you can tell me what that means. But, well, just tell me now.
Sure. I'll put another map on the screen, which is a map of orthophoto, which is taken from the sky. And it may help you see the conveyances or the paths in which water flow. The one that I mentioned that went through the property is here, and you can see that it looks like a ditch from the sky, especially if you're used to looking at these orthophotos. If you're not, you may not be as familiar with it. But this is where water currently has a path to travel. And you can also see by the color that there's located here and a little bit here, and then wraps around. So that, and I've heard rumors of where this came from, and I think the person who did it probably is part of the ownership team now, but those are those physical elements that currently exist on the property that we think will restrict any future development, or at least cause it to be addressed.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. With that, we'll open the public hearing. Invite anyone that'd like to speak on this, pro or con, please come to the podium and give us your name and address.
Mr. Young and members of the Planning Commission, I'm Matt Murphy, attorney with Murphy & Murphy Attorneys, and I'm here tonight representing Mr. David Waldron, who owns the tract in question. We are requesting that 3.6 acres that belong to Mr. Waldron be rezoned from RS10 to commercial highway. The property in question, as indicated, is located on Rutherford Boulevard at the corner of the Bradeville Pike. It also fronts on Floyd and Willis Streets. As you are all aware, Rutherford Boulevard has become a major corridor in our city. Many citizens use it to go from MTSU to I-24 and from I-24 to MTSU. At present, there are extensive commercial developments on the intersection of Rutherford and Church Street, Rutherford and the Manchester Highway, and Rutherford and John Bragg Highway. And the John Bragg Highway intersection, of course, is where Walmart and lots of other commercial development is. And that's just north of the site we're talking about tonight. There are several reasons that Mr. Waldron would like to have this rezoned. First of all, it is probably not a good location for residential use. It's on a major corridor surrounded by streets, but perhaps more importantly is the drainage ditch that was referred to when you were shown it on the map. Mr. Waldron tells me that when his father developed Wilson Estates, he put him on a bulldozer, and he's the one that did the drainage plan for Wilson Estates. And the lot in question on the subdivision plat, it was indicated it was reserved property, but through the middle, Mr. Waldron dug a ditch, and all the water from that subdivision comes to that ditch, and basically he didn't do a very good job because it comes to that ditch and pools there. So we have a big sort of swamp area. Because of that, nobody could develop with that situation, and we found that we needed to go before the state environmental people and to the Corps of Engineers to talk with them about the potential of doing any development, residential, commercial, or whatever. And after months and months of dealing with those agencies, I think each one of them had a public hearing. Mr. Waldron has secured a permit where the drainage area can be encapsulated and directed and go into the water flow out on the Bradeville Rutherford Pike. In other words, it won't stand anymore. I've been out there many times, and during the summer, the mosquitoes are unbelievable. So this would not only remove a hazard where children could be in trouble if they got over in the water, but it would also remove a breeding ground for mosquitoes. But in any event, we got our permit, but unfortunately the cost of doing all this makes it very unrealistic to do the work without commercial zoning. One part of these plans are you have to substitute and buy wetlands and substitute them from an area that really wasn't a wetland but became a wetland when the ditch was dug, because for many years the water has been pooling there. So the expense of doing all that is not a minor expense, and we feel like this is a suitable use of the property, not only because it's probably not viable for residential use, but we're not going to be able to solve the drainage problem and the swamp in the middle of it without higher use to sell it for. Mr. Waldron has entered a contract with Speedway, and I think some of you are familiar with that company. And Mr. Jonathan Walker is here tonight, who is a landscape architect with Speedway that has worked with the city on several other projects in our community. Mr. Walker came many, many months ago, but we had other things we had to work out related to the wetland issue. But he met with the city, and I attended these meetings many times. And one thing he was told by the city, that for his development, which would be the first part right on Rutherford Boulevard of the property, that he needed to be very sensitive to the neighbors that lived in that area. And as a result of that, in the preliminary drawings of his site plan, he has been made many changes to his initial plan, one of which is not to have a major entrance or exit on Floyd Street. Another is a turn lane on the Bradeville Highway, and he has worked very much in trying to do something that would not, in our opinion, impact the neighborhood negatively. Mr. Waldron will still own the property to the rear of the Speedway plan, and his engineer, Steve Steele, is here tonight, who can probably answer questions about the encapsulation of the water, or maybe Mr. Walker can, and where it's going to go from here. As I understand, part of it will be piped as opposed to flowing on the top of the land. But in any event, Mr. Steele has worked with staff and attended these meetings, and they don't have a prospect for that site. There will be a site plan, but he too is very sensitive to the neighborhood concerns in that area. I might tell you, as I say, Mr. Waldron kept that track. It was marked reserved, and I believe in the last day or two, Mr. Waldron, when I say Mr. Waldron, Mr. Bester Waldron, kept that track, and it was marked reserved. But Mr. Steele has submitted to the city a subdivision plat, and it will be divided between the Speedway track and the track Mr. Waldron is keeping. At this time, I would invite Mr. Walker or Mr. Steele to come up and perhaps tell what they've been involved in and answer any questions you may have.
Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Jonathan Woker. My address is 5725 Dragon Way, Suite 220, Cincinnati, Ohio. And I am a representative here for Speedway. And as Mr. Murphy explained, we've been working with Mr. Waldron's team for several months, more like a year and a half or so, and also with Mr. Adelot's staff, and have been working to understand the overall concepts for access, for traffic improvements, and for landscaping. And so we look forward to an opportunity to come before you at the appropriate time with a detailed site plan, which will have all of the information that you'll need at that time to evaluate our site plan. We're interested in this site for many of the reasons that Mr. Murphy explained. We find this to be a commercially viable site, and would agree with his assertions that a residential use of this property is really not the appropriate designation. So I will try and answer questions if you have them.
Any questions for Mr. Walker?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to speak. I am Steve Steele with Huddleston Steel Engineering. I am working with Mr. David Waldron, the owner of this property. If you have, Mr. Murphy did a good job of laying out what we are planning to do, but if you have engineering questions that I can address, I will be glad to do so for you. Of course, we will come back if this is approved at some time in the future with the site plan for Mr. Waldron's property, and we're very aware of the issues and concerns that we would have to address to make sure that this commercial venture would blend in with the surrounding neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steele.
I've got one question you or Mr. Murphy can answer. Of course, we're contemplating the whole parcel. I understand it's going to be 2 parcels after it's all said and done. Comment was made that there would be no entrance into the Speedway site off of Floyd. So are we making that same comment or assurance with respects to the rear parcel, or that's not part of this application, or we're not making that same assurance?
We are making that same assurance. When you see our subdivision plat at the meeting in a few weeks, you will see that we have a joint ingress, egress, or access easement that will carry the traffic through from the commercial highways into these 2 developments and keep it off of the surrounding residential development.
Thank you.
Mr. Halliburton, I think he said no major entrance. I don't remember him saying no entrance. Mr. Murphy may have to address that. I just didn't want you to be under an impression since I heard major.
I didn't understand the question.
You mentioned in your presentation about the entrance onto Floyd Avenue. Did you say no, there wouldn't be a major entrance, or or no entrance at all?
No, of course, the site plan is not come, but there will be an entrance on Rutherford. There will be a drive between the 2 lots from Floyd to the Bradyville Pike. It's going to divide the 2 lots, but that will be a secondary entrance, not a major entrance. And that's one of the things that we, working with staff, Speedway really would have preferred if that was a major entrance to the site. It is an entrance and an exit, but it's a secondary road that splits the 2 lots. Have I said that correct, Jonathan and Steve?
Will there be another entrance on the A major entrance.
So there's no entrance on Floyd?
There is.
There is an entrance on Floyd. I still don't understand.
I'll take a shot at explaining that. Our plan is to have our main entrance from Bradyville and to have a full access there. At that driveway, we would share that with the future use of Mr. Waldron's property. We would then have a driveway on Rutherford, which would in essence be a right in, right out, because there's a median in the property. And then those 2 driveways would be the route that our fuel truck would use, and that would be what we would designate our commercial route, for any of our deliveries and our primary interest for customers. The entrance that we propose on Floyd would be limited in width, and it would primarily be for customers from the subdivision behind. So there would be an access proposed on Floyd, but again, it would be much narrower and would not be designed to handle truck traffic or commercial traffic. That's our plan as of now, and we would obviously work on those details as we get to that point.
Thank you for that clarification.
You're welcome.
I might say, as to that drive, initially Speedway wanted to have a major entrance and exit on Floyd and downsized it because of perhaps concerns. Mr. Waldron has also, with Mr. Steele, he does not propose to have any entrance or exit for his remaining lot on Willow Drive at all. His lot would be Bradyville Pike plus this joint use easement between the lots.
Thank you.
That helps. Any other questions from the Planning Commission? Okay, Eddie, go ahead.
I guess, Mr. Murphy, you're welcome to try this, or if you'd like to appoint somebody else to answer it, I'll be glad to listen. The water that's currently there and leaving this lot cannot leave at a greater rate than what it currently leaves, I'm assuming. Will there be a retention pond in the plan, or is this simply going to be a ditch with a pipe that's going to move the water more quickly?
I'll ask Mr. Steele or Mr. Walker to answer that. As I understand it right now, it just stands there, but their plan is that it would be encapsulated, I guess that's a word, and drained off the site. But Steve?
And I think encapsulated is where I'm confused. Are we talking retention, detention, or just moving it with a pipe? Thank you, Ken.
It's probably a little bit of all three. What you got is a condition where most of the water that comes onto this 3.5-acre site is coming from off-site. So that water is draining by ditches along the sides of the road. It hits a pipe in Willow Drive, and then it spills out into this area. Now, that water is already coming this way. That water would be permitted to keep running as it would if there wasn't a spot that held water. So that water will be put into a pipe across the lot, and then turned loose probably on the Bradeville Pike, and then it'll go into the pipes that are at the intersection of Bradeville and Rutherford. Now, the water that falls on this 3.5 acres, that's a different story. That water will have to be treated for both stormwater quality and quantity, as every other development is here in the city of Murfreesboro. So there's some that will pass through. There's some that what falls on the lot will be treated for quality and quantity. We've not done an engineering plan per se of how we'll do that. I suspect there will be components of detention. There may be other components that the city will allow, but we'll have to meet the requirements of the city in that regard. There's also water that moves down Rutherford and Bradeville too. That Bradeville-Rutherford intersection is a major drainage intersection. That's why when you look at the aerial photo that Ms. Green showed us, you see those areas from above that are actually drainage ways. And that main one, it cuts through the middle, we want to pipe or encapsulate, and we will probably move it a little bit, but that's just to keep the water moving. But the other water that falls on the site will have to be treated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we're in the public hearing portion, so if anyone else would like to come and speak, please come forward.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lucky Sandar, and I live on 2302 Floyd Avenue. That property is literally across the street from me. So I've been living there since I was in the 4th grade. I actually share that with my parents and my sister. So that area also has a stop sign there, and that is the only exit to Willow Drive. So they have to go through my area, that stop sign, to get out of the neighborhood. So there's an outward, because our street used to be Floyd Drive, and now it's been changed to Floyd Avenue, so we're actually able to get out. So if there was something was to go wrong with the speedway, something like a robbery, I work for a bank. And I mean, we know none of us wants to have anything robbed or anything to go wrong, but that's in the perfect world. But we don't live in a perfect world. So if something was to go wrong, and if something was to go wrong with the speedway or whatever commercial building that they have decided to build there, I understand. However, that is the only exit that all of those people in that area get to leave from, is from my part, because my home is adjacent to Willow, and it's right across the street. And if it was to be a playground for the entire residential area, that would be different. Not even a quarter of a mile, there's a gas station right there. There's a Walmart there. There is a Walmart gas station there. The other opposite direction is also another Kangaroo there. There's a school there. There's also Publix there. And if they were just to go just a half a more mile, there's a Kroger there, and also the gas station, BP, Shell, you name it, it's there. I don't find that it's necessary to make it as a commercial property when everywhere else you look around is all residential. I can run there faster than a car can get over there because of the traffic. So putting an actual gas station there or anything commercial when the surrounding areas are all residential will create more traffic when you have all the commercial within not even a mile away. You have a triangle of commercial. We even have a Dollar General right down the road, an actual Tire Lou Valvoline place there. There's even a strip malls there. There's Pizza Hut. There's everything you can think of that's around that area. You want Jet, it's right down the road. If you want Papa John's, it's right there. So it's always right there. I just don't find it where it's necessary for it to actually have a gas station there when you can have one not even a quarter of a mile away. MTSU is right down the road. I graduated from MTSU. If it's an MTSU issue, MTSU students rent from across the street from us. So, I mean, and of course there's that drainage there, and I've actually even walked through that area to get to school when I went to Black Fox Elementary, and when it's a dry day, it's dry. There's nothing there. There's no swamp. There's no water or anything like that. So what I'm saying is, if it was going to be a playground where the community for the residential area can use, and also if there was going to be another exit for Willow Drive to get out of instead of for them to be trapped, because if something was to go wrong, where can they go? They can't get out. So I'm open for any questions or any concerns you may have. And otherwise, thank you for listening.
Thank you, sir. Would anyone else like to speak?
Hello, my name is Mr. Key Tang. A lot of people here in Murfreesboro knows me by Keys. Mr. Joseph and this man, I forgot his name, knew me well. We had dealt with this kind of problem in the past. Took me 2 years to get my case straightened out, but here we are again. I'm one of those kind of people that don't like other people to enforce odd rules, unfairly rules, or try to take things away from me where I rightfully own it. The problem I'm having with this location is, like Lucky has just said, I'm the third house down. My mother-in-law lives with us. She's 80 years old, very healthy. She walks Willow as often as she can to stay fit. She grows her own vegetable in the backyard and the front. All the kids in the neighborhoods know one and another. The problem that it's going to have for her is that for us also, most importantly, gas station open up 24 hours a day. There's a bunch of lights that they have to have for security, for the patron, for whatever. It's so bright, it's just like daylight all the time. My main concern, the other one, is the vapor that's coming out from the gas station, from the truck, from people pumping the gas and all this. It's an on and on issue. You are inhaling the vapor in your lung. I had handled all kind of chemical in the past from different places. I have to switch job because you cannot be exposed to them for a certain amount of time. Otherwise, you will have lung cancer or issue or things like that. This gas station will cause this issue for every one of us that live there. On Willow Drive, if you check on your records, most of these people had been there ever since the community had been developed. And they plan to retire there, and most of them are getting very close to retire from, whether from Nissans or Bridgestones or Pillsbury. They live there. They're not going to go there because, reason for that, they had worked hard to pay for their property, and they cannot afford to move to all this new development because it's so expensive. They plan to live there and stay there until the day they die. But to put this gas station there, it can only put more stress for them. If they can't stand living there, they're going to have to move. Can they afford it? No. The value of the home in Murfreesboro has gone up so high. And I had just recently paid off my home also. So to start over from a $90,000 home to a $250,000 home is going to put us back to another 30 years mortgage. It's not fair for us and for everyone that lives there. We're going to have to start making new friends, neighbors, and so forth. I'm here to say that just don't change it to commercial highway. We don't want another gas station. I actually had drove out there today. We got a gas station at Walmart 1 mile away. Golden Gallon, 0.8 of a mile. USA Market, 0.7 of a mile. Kroger right next to it. And then Kwikset, 1.5, 1.7. How many gas stations do we need? I mean, are we going to be that stupid to not drive more than 10 minutes to get gas? Or are we all so fat and lazy that we don't want to go anywhere and just walk over to the other side of the street to get gas? That's, I'm here to let you know that if this thing had passed, I will be very disappointed because we all counted on you all because we elected you people to do the right thing. You got to put yourself in our shoes. Just don't pass it and let it be a residential like it was meant to be. They can build houses and it will be sold very quickly, like they said. There's a lot of shortage of houses, new home, and so forth. They won't have any issue selling it as a residence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keys. Anyone else like to speak?
I'm Richard Baines. I live on Parkview Terrace, and I don't have any skin in this deal here, but there was one thing that was brought up by Mr. Steele I'd like to have clarified, and that is treatment of one of the retention ponds. And I would like to know why a retention pond has to be treated and with what, and has this been coordinated with the Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department Stormwater Group? Thank you. If Mr. Steele would like to answer that question. Or would the Commission like to ask Mr. Steele?
At the end of the public hearing, we will address all the questions. The staff is taking notes. I'm taking notes. We want to answer all your questions at the end, but we need to do it at the end so everybody can speak that wants to speak. Is there anyone else that would like to speak?
Good evening, Planning Commission. My name is Selena Sumpunpakdi, and I live at 2346 Willow Drive. And I'm against this establishment of Speedway or anything else commercial on that land because, to start off, there's a lot of children that live in the neighborhood, and buses come in the morning, they drop them off at night, or I'm sorry, not at night, in the afternoon, and it would be very dangerous for the children to get off the bus and also get on the bus with that Speedway there because they might get abducted or something bad might happen. And also it's concern for myself because, I go home, sometimes it's late and I don't want anybody following me and, it might be scary with that establishment there. But if it was a residential establishment there, it'd be something different. And also with it being said before how the entrance and the exit would be on Rutherford. I have to get on Floyd and then Rutherford to get out of the neighborhood. And as said before, Rutherford is very busy, I-24, MTSU, so on. And it's already tough trying to get in and out of there. So with the Speedway being on Bradyville, it's going to be tough for me. It's going to be even more tough for me to have to get out onto the main road because even if there's a car parked on the side of Bradyville in front of that lot, you can't see anything. You're not going to be able to get anywhere, and it's a hazard. And if there's any questions or concerns, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you for hearing me out.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Hello, everyone. My name is Brenda Jordan, and I live at 2306 Floyd Avenue. I live on Floyd Avenue, about 2 houses down from Willow. I hadn't planned on saying anything. I just wanted to come and get information and to understand better about the zoning. But as everyone has stated, I would like to make my concerns known also. Me and my husband's been living in this neighborhood for about 23 years. It's the beginning of Floyd Avenue. It's quiet. It's peaceful. We haven't had any problems or anything. My concern is that the noise, the lighting, the trafficking, and just like the young lady said, it's already hard to get to go out onto Rutherford from Floyd, making a left turn. I just think this would not be a good place to put a gas station. My concerns is about having a gas station right there. Really, to me, it's a danger to our community. So that's my concerns, and I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Betty Vaughn Evans, and I own a home at 2314 Willow Drive. I've been a homeowner in that area since 1989. I simply stand here tonight to be in agreement with everything that I have heard from the people that are coming, expressing the concerns against the Speedway. I agree there's something needs to be done at that corner. It's been an eyesore and a source of concern environmentally for 25 years that I know of. And I'm certainly glad that they're trying to consider doing something in that area. This area is highly residential. A lot of children, a lot of elderly people, retired people, people who just want to live in a quiet neighborhood. This planning that you all are proposing here tonight is not conducive to positive neighborhood living. And I would just suggest that you really reconsider that in light of the things that you've heard tonight from the people living in the area. Willow Drive is right behind Floyd, and a house that I own is just second house down. It's too close for comfort. It's too close for comfort. I'm totally in disagreement with that. And I really thank you for hearing my concerns.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Anyone else like to speak? Anyone at all? Last call. Anyone like to speak? Hearing none, we'll close the public hearing. Ms. Green, we've had some questions posed, and I'm sure you and Mr. Alott were taking notes. I'd like for you to start trying to answer some of the questions for the audience.
Sure. We did hear quite a few comments, maybe not as many questions, and we have, of course, many people who live in this area and have for a long time, so we understand that they have some concerns. I think some of the reoccurring themes were there were questions about lighting, and we would expect that the site be lit. We want it to be safe for people who visit the site. Our standards would not allow that lighting to spill over into adjacent properties. We don't allow more than half a foot candle to go beyond the property line, and we require those fixtures to be shielded so that they don't cause any glare. So absolutely, I expect the site to be lit well for safety reasons, but we would not allow that to light up the entire neighborhood because we have standards in place to protect that, because that is something that we want to avoid in people's backyards. And then, so I think lighting, noise, traffic were the major concerns. I'm not sure what they meant by noise from what in the gas station, maybe the vehicles visiting the gas station. If it were music playing, of course, our noise ordinance would regulate that, and we wouldn't allow them to have music that would be loud enough to leave the site. But I'm only assuming that maybe they were talking about the vehicles when they're talking about noise that would visit the site. And I'm not sure what to say to that, the fact that vehicles will be visiting the site, because we expect for them to, because it is a gas station. And then traffic, that's something that is a concern for people who live in Murfreesboro. And these are two major arterials in our community, and we know that they are heavily traveled, and I think that's part of the draw for something like a speedway is that there's so many vehicles that pass this area. We would, of course, look at the placement of any drives, require those shared access drives, which were mentioned by the design or the representatives of the applicant. We want to minimize the number of drives onto the property and then require only right-in, right-outs in areas where it would be safe to cross the highway at that point. Let's see. I'm not really sure how abducted children or people, how it relates to gas stations. Haven't read any information from our police department, and I guess I could ask for some numbers, but I don't understand the correlation between.
I think her concern was that there would be activity 20 hours a day, 15 hours a day that's not there now, and it might bring in people into the neighborhood that are not there now.
People come to the site to get gas from outside the neighborhood. Very well may be. I'm not sure. But Mr. Aylott, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Well, I think we need to answer Mr. Baines' question, and perhaps Mr. Steele, I'll answer it for him since he was. It was his statement that Mr. Baines was asking about the treatment for the stormwater.
I'll be glad to try, Mr. Aylott. And, sir, were you asking?
He wanted to know what you were going to treat the water in the retention pond with. Or for.
Well, let me back up just a little bit, if I could. The rules that we're talking about come down from the federal government as a result of the Clean Water Act, down to the state, down to the community, down to the developer, down to me. I'm at the bottom of the chain. But basically, the rules that we operate under now require that when we develop or redevelop a site, that we manage is probably a better word, the stormwater. When I use the verb treat, I mean to manage it. And we have to manage it in two respects. One, the quantity. We cannot allow any more water to leave our site than what would leave it today. Secondly, we cannot allow that water to be polluted. So there are certain practices that the city has adopted which are called best management practices that are ways that you can capture the stormwater when it hits the pavement, you collect it, and you treat it before it's released. So the idea is to keep pollutants from getting down to the stream. Now, generally, we address this at the site plan level because when we come in with the site plan, we'll show where the building will be, where the pavement will be, where the stormwater treatment will be. So I'm speaking somewhat hypothetically, but in general, I don't know if I've answered your question or not. I'm looking at you and I'm not sure.
I believe he was thinking treating was sounding like you're putting chemicals in the water. When you're talking about treating, you're talking about letting the water sit and percolate into the soil, or putting a water quality unit in there that will help filter sediment and pollution from the water. But you're not putting chemicals in the water.
No, well, not necessarily. No, generally not. There are some management techniques or treatments that do involve adding a chemical like they do in the water plant, and that chemical causes pollutants to flocculate, to fall out of the water. We're not planning to do that, but that is something that some people do. The requirement is an end result requirement that the water needs to be clean when it leaves. It really doesn't tell us how to do it, but we have guidance from the city and the state in the way of what we call best management practices. But we're not planning to put anything into the stormwater. We're trying to keep paper cups and trash and grass and fertilizer and all those sorts of things out of the stormwater.
All right, and Mr. Baines, and also to answer your question, and thank you, Mr. Steele. I see that you passed the test.
Thank you.
The other part, Mr. Baines, the other part is that the Water and Sewer Department and the stormwater coordinator will be involved with the review of the plans before any permits are issued. That is standard operating practice in our department, and they will be.
And there was one other, just if you would address, one of you all, the reference to vapors causing a problem. I'm sure there must be some sort of ordinances that cover for that, or we'd have problems in all the gas stations we've got.
Actually, I believe that Mr. Walker might be able to answer that, but I think that in pretty much all stations that are developed now have a vapor recovery system that's pretty much mandatory. Wouldn't that be correct, Mr. Walker, with your stations?
Jonathan Walker again. That is correct. So the newest technology that my client would install would be a vapor recovery system. So it's a system that manages the fuel tanks, and so when the fuel is delivered, there's a process whereby the vapors are recovered and are not released to the air. I hope that's a reasonable explanation, because I'm not sure I can go in a lot more detail, but there is also a system of vent stacks that prevent fumes and other vapors from accumulating on the site. We have to go through a state review process and permitting for our underground tanks and piping systems. It's a process that goes through TDEC, the environmental agency for the state, and we would obviously obtain those permits. We actually have to have a construction permit for, they call it air pollution. We have to have on-site inspections of our system before they can be used to ensure that that's working. There was a question about access. We intend to have a driveway that would connect from Floyd to Bradyville, would kind of act as a release valve. If there is some blockage of Floyd, I would think that there would be that opportunity to use this as a connection to circulate from Floyd to Bradyville. And so I think we may actually be relieving some circulation issues that were mentioned.
And while you're there, I guess I'm not that familiar with Speedway, and we keep referring to it as a gas station. Is there also a convenience store?
Yes, sir, there is.
Okay.
And so the store itself is approximately 4,000 square feet. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, fuel is an integral component of the Speedway model, but they also are a neighborhood convenience store. And so one of the components that Speedway prides themselves on, and I hope as Murfreesboro residents you'll get used to this, is their coffee sales and their food options as well. So they have a Speedy Cafe, they call it. So it's kind of a made-to-order cafe where you can buy food, paninis and other made-to-order items. They have a wide selection of beverages, and they have foods inside. So they're not a grocery, but they are a convenience store, and that's a significant component of why they're interested in locating here.
I have a question for you. You had mentioned the extension of Floyd down through this. That would, if the neighbors could use that, that would give them access to the Bradyville Pike, which would give them access to the red light. And as they come out of Floyd now, as I see this, it's a right only, right in, right out.
Correct.
Is that correct, neighbors?
No, they can turn left.
Oh, they can turn left?
Left.
Okay, you got a median there. I'm sorry, I missed that point.
Yeah, Mr. Young, we intend to complete a full traffic study, including signal evaluation of the traffic signal at Bradyville and Rutherford. Our preliminary indications in working with the city traffic department would require a right turn lane into our site on Rutherford, and that would extend likely through Floyd, and we are likely to have to make improvements on Rutherford to allow improved circulation onto Floyd and other improvements. But as you mentioned, our plan would be to have a it's a driveway. It's not intended to be a street, but a driveway that would connect from Bradyville, that would be shared with Mr. Waldron's property. That would be the only entrance planned on Bradyville, and then that would be on the shared property line, and then that would curve to the north, I believe, if that's the right direction, and then intersect with Floyd. So it's not intended to be a street, but it is intended to be a circulation route. Our objective would be to have our customers enter and exit from Bradyville and Rutherford. Floyd, we definitely understand Floyd is a secondary access, and it's not our intention to direct traffic there. But we also recognize that there are customers there, and actually we think that driveway is the right thing to do for that location.
Ms. Jones?
You may know, and I just guess I totally missed this when we discussed this at the original the work session or scheduled this public hearing, that you were not going to be taking up the full 3.6 acres, that this was going to be divided into two different parcels. So of the 3.6 acres, how much is Speedway looking at?
I believe we're approximately 1.8 or 1.9 acres. I think that's a little more than half. The shape of this property is a little bit strange, so we would have the northern trapezoid part of the site, and so that makes our site a little not quite rectangular, and then Mr. Waldron would retain the southern portion, which would be approximately 1.4 or 5 acres. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I want to make some comments. We kind of got a dilemma here in some ways. We've got a very old established neighborhood that these people have lived in that neighborhood most of their lives. Their children were reared there, and they live there now, and it's their home. But also, the land that is owned there has been owned by the same family for 30 years, and his family developed the subdivision that you live in. I think there's still some unanswered questions. I think that that I don't have a totally clear understanding with this. I understand our ordinance on landscaping that the road is the buffer, say from where Floyd is and down to Willow. I would like to see that some way modified to put in a better buffer, even though it may not be required, because you're going to have a driveway coming through there. I just would like to see a little more information with this, and I think the neighbors would like to see a little more information with this. So with that, I would think that I'm going to move for deferral. I don't know if that's if I may not get a second, I don't know, but
Chairman, you can make a motion.
I can make a motion to the chairman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, the chairman can make a motion under our rules of procedure, or the vice chair if he's presiding.
Okay. Would it be appropriate, whether this is approved, if it's disapproved, it's irrelevant, but if it's approved, would it be more appropriate to let them see the site plan prior to the presentation that would come before us again, so that, like you say, the buffer issue, I think that would be the time to address that, because, to address a buffer issue when there's no site plan is kind of difficult to do.
And we do have site plan review, and that's where most of the sausage is made, the final site plan review. But I think we need to talk about this a little bit longer. I think the applicant understands that it is a sensitive area, but here again, it's probably not the highest and the best use to build houses on that lot. And it's a commercial corner. But we also have to be very sensitive to the neighborhoods, because these like any neighbor, they're concerned about their safety and their well-being and their neighborhood deteriorating and all that. And that's a problem we have all over the city. But I'm not convinced that all the answers have come to us tonight. I fully understand that at site plan review, many of these issues will be shown to us, but I think we need a little bit more information, not only for me, but for the neighbors.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to second your motion and just state that I'm as much concerned about the fact that there's a remaining parcel now that I didn't really, I guess, like I say, I just missed that just to have the blanket commercial highway zone right there in the middle of the residential, and it's just a remaining parcel. I'm concerned about that, and so again, would like to see, the subdivision, how that would be planned, and whether we can have additional buffers or what we can do about that, because I do think that's a concern in the middle of this residential spot.
I know Mr. Steele by reputation. He has a very good reputation for working out problems. Mr. Walker, you've heard all this. Just use your creativity to solve some of these problems and address some of these issues and solve the problems and address as many of the neighborhood issues as we can. I would like to say to the neighbors, this is a commercial corner. I don't think it's a residential corner. I don't think it's ever been a residential corner. It was set aside 30 years ago to be a commercial corner. So he's following through with his plan, just like you followed through with your plan to live in that neighborhood and make it a great neighborhood. So I think we need to work on this a little bit. And I have a motion and a second to defer. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. We will have a deferral on this. Okay, thank you. Our next item is a PCD and a PRD amendment for approximately 2.08 acres along Middle Tennessee Boulevard and East Main Street. Mr. John Nebel, applicant.
Thank you, sir. Our final public hearing this evening is for you to consider amending an existing zone or two existing zones on property that are approximately 2.08 acres. The map shows you the properties. The area shaded blue is currently zoned PCD, and PCD stands for Planned Commercial District. The area shaded orange is zoned PRD, and that's Planned Residential District. And the remaining part of the PRD is located south of East Vine Street. However, it's not a part of this application, so it's not shown on the map before you. These properties, which are zoned PRD and PCD, were zoned such several years ago to allow a development of a commercial area and some multifamily, which are single-family attached dwellings. The property is located south of East Main Street, and it's located to the east of Middle Tennessee Boulevard. It's also located to the west of 4th Avenue, and this property is north of East Vine Street. You recently reviewed an application to amend the plan development. However, this is a separate application, so we've identified this as file number 425B because it's the second part of a request which you've previously reviewed. The application is to amend the PCD and PRD zoning in order to allow an increase in the square footage allowed for restaurant use and to allow some of the area that's approved for use and development as townhome residential structures to be used for parking. And that would be, so the existing restaurant on the site is the Boulevard Restaurant, which I think several of us are familiar with, and there are some commercial suites located along Middle Tennessee Boulevard. The Boulevard would like to extend into those commercial suites, thereby increasing the size of the restaurant. Property is zoned PCD, so there's a very specific plan that was approved and is allowed for the property. So to change that specific plan, they have to go through this amendment process. To compensate for the additional restaurant space, which would require additional parking based on our standards, the area shaded orange located along East Vine Street is not developed at this time. However, they would like to construct some surface parking spaces on this area. So that would be changing the use that would be allowed in that PRD. So there's a letter from Mr. Taylor, and I'll invite him to the lectern in just a moment describing the change. But it is to allow the expansion of that restaurant into the adjacent existing building and then to allow the residential area to be used for parking along East Vine Street. The part of their plan is also to allow the entitlement for that residential portion of development to remain based on finding additional parking in the future. I'll go ahead and invite Mr. Taylor to the lectern. The Planning Commission should conduct a public hearing prior to making your recommendation to City Council. If you have questions, staff will be most happy to answer them, as well as representatives of the applicant.
Good evening, Chairman Young, members of the Planning Commission. Ms. Green did a good job describing our application. The applicants are the owners of the Boulevard Restaurant itself, and they have a desire and have identified a need in this portion of the town to develop a, not necessarily an event space, but a meeting space. It's not just generic restaurant seating they're looking to add. They want a separate room that somebody could call and reserve while ordering their food and their drinks, but maybe do some training or a small get-together for maybe a smaller company. And so that's what they would like to use that area for. They've identified that with that expanded restaurant space, they do need to provide the appropriate parking, and so that's the reason for the request to add the parking along East Vine Street there. And they would like to retain the right to for those future townhomes if they can find somebody else, another lot to purchase and build parking spaces on, or maybe these uses change around and they don't need as much parking in the future. Whatever that scenario may be, they identify that something has to change. It can't just go and happen next year. So there has to be a paradigm change there. So myself, as well as Mr. Neville, are here. Be happy to answer any questions that you might have for us.
Any questions for Mr. Taylor to start off with? All right, if there are no questions, we'll open the public hearing and ask anyone to come and speak before this matter.
Chairman Young, members of the Commission, I'm Richard Baines. I live at on Parkview Terrace here in Murfreesboro. Before getting into the nuts and bolts of why I'm here tonight, I'd like to make something very clear. And that being, while I may use the term plat or plan in my presentation, I understand that this hearing is about zoning, and that is the issue I will address. I'm very familiar with this area of development, and I'm a regular customer at the Boulevard Bar and Grill, and I love that place. I was very happy to see that there are plans to expand the facility. I understand the expansion from a business standpoint. The Boulevard is a destination. The previous occupants of this 3,100 square feet, that business was not a destination, and that's what doomed it. The building has remained unoccupied since Verizon left, and I think this is a very good use of that space, and I look forward to this being approved and that facility being expanded. The developers produced, the reason this even came to my attention was I was looking at the zoning request and the plats, and they're produced quite a few different, or actually a couple of different plats or plans, and that's what drew my attention to the zoning change request. And going over the request cover letter dated September 12th, I noted that the applicant would like to temporarily rezone an area along Vine Street from PRD to PCD while retaining the right to switch back when additional parking is found off-site. This proposal amounts to dual zoning, or at least temporary zoning, and that seems to hinge on this. Actually, it does hinge on the success or failure of the addition to the Boulevard Bar and Grill. If in the future the addition to the Boulevard Bar and Grill don't pan out, the additional parking may not be needed. My thinking is the zoning should reflect the current use of the property, and if the use changes, the owner should reapply to the planning department for a zoning change rather than be allowed to choose zoning from a pre-approved menu. which is exactly what they're asking for, or the owner is asking for. This looks like a great addition to the area, and I would hate to see its development clouded by approving in its present form, the request for a zoning change. I would ask that the commission require the developer to resubmit the request without the entitlement language. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Baines. We'll come back to you in a minute or so, if we need to. Sir, would you like to speak? Okay. If anyone else would like to speak, please come forward. Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Ms. Dadelot, explain to me, the way I understand this is he's getting more parking now. And if he chooses in the future to do something else, he's still going to have to meet our parking requirements no matter what he does.
That is correct. And let me see if I can help clarify something that Mr. Bain has made a little bit more complicated. He's not asking to change his entitlement entirely. What he is asking to do is to be allowed to take an area that is currently being used either for green space or as parking while it's waiting to be developed with residential, because it's already entitled for residential, but to use it as parking to support a restaurant area.
An expansion
within
of the
this
restaurant.
An expansion, actually a part of the building. But bear in mind, we're not talking about new external construction of the building. But part of it comes to do with a numbers analysis. Retail or office is required to have one parking space for every 300 square feet. A restaurant is required to have parking spaces at the rate of one for every 100 square feet or one for every 2 seats. It's almost 3 times as much as a office or a retail. So what he's wanting to do is to take an area that was calibrated, if you will, for retail or office, but to use it instead as restaurant. Therefore, that part of the site is now a little bit on the low end of the numbers of parking spaces required. Meanwhile, on the same block, there is a part of the land that was set aside for residential townhomes based upon the expectation that the area he wants to use as a restaurant was to be used as retail. So he's willing to forego having that built as residential until he can come up with parking that would support it. What is happening, and it's ongoing, to the south of Vine Street is another part of the same PRD, the same residential structures, and it fronts on Middle Tennessee Boulevard. The owners of that property are getting ready to build those condominium units. But they're also attempting to reach out to the property owners that front all the way over on 4th Avenue to see if they can acquire that land to redevelop also. Because they believe they're bringing something of value to our community, and they feel that they'd like to do it. But their initial overtures are not meeting our applicant's timeline. If they're successful, they're going to help make and improve the parking dynamic for that whole block. If they're unsuccessful, Mr. Nebel will continue to operate his restaurant. And it may be that he comes back someday and says, guys, the restaurant didn't work, I want to do something different. And he will make an application. But he wants to be able to retain the ability to go back to the condominiums without having to come back. Bear in mind the application process, while Mr. Baines does point out that something that is probably, if we lived in a wonderful world where things happen quick, it would be no problem. But the zoning application process takes about 120 days. And making a business decision, that can be very complicated. So he would like to be able to retain the current entitlement of residential, the condominiums, as we've already signed off on, but not develop them until he can find a place that meets our parking requirements to support them, or the commercial off-site. Does that help to clarify the situation?
It does. So if he can't meet the parking requirements, he can't do anything.
That's right.
So we're protected. The city's protected.
Absolutely.
Is everything that the applicant is proposing, my sinuses are kicking in, is fully in the rules, regulations, and the ordinance of the city of Murfreesboro?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, sir.
Any questions?
And I do not believe that this is a contract zoning either.
The way my simple mind understands it is he's asking for more parking. And if we approve it, he'll get it.
Well,
at the time he wants to build the condos, he's got to meet those parking requirements at that particular time and space.
That's right. And y'all, there's something else that kind of adds into this, and that's sort of a push by staff. Bear in mind that people go out there and park on that grass area already. They just do it. And it's not what we want. We don't want people parking on grass areas and tracking mud into the street and causing operational problems. Staff is pushing them to address that. It would be just fine to him, let them keep doing it, except we're not going to allow him to keep doing that. He's got to fix the parking. So we're kind of pushing him in the direction of building a properly designed, first-class looking, compliant parking lot. And that's what he has brought to us.
I think this is a win-win, and I'll make a motion that we approve.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Did we close the public hearing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Have a motion and a second for approval. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. Ms. Daylight, Ms. Green, are there any staff reports or other business?
Not for me.
Only my usual admonishment about get your training done. If you have not, time is running out. We're in our last quarter. See Mr. Lewis if you have doubts about whether or not you've met your training requirements.
Councilman Smotherman is a good example of hitting the ground running on looking for continuing education opportunities as soon as he's hit the Planning Commission.
Is he going to be required to have all of them by the... Oh, did you?
He will. He will.
With hearing no other business, we are adjourned.